We're delighted to welcome Clare here tonight as part of the Conversations series in Imagine Spaces, which is a research and practice-based platform which is dedicated to, and I'm just going to read this bit out because I think it came from you, Kirsty, exploring new ways of thinking on the page, which I think really describes what we'll be talking about tonight. I'm Loretta Mulholland. I'm studying at the moment a PhD and looking at how to write history more creatively. So I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this and to be speaking to Clare about her decision to write in the way that she did. Clare is a friend to Imagine Spaces. I think she studied with Kirsty and Jim Stewart previously, and has collaborated on other projects associated with Imagine Spaces and Jura projects, Dundee's University Review of the Arts magazine, and also on the Solitaire projects. So delighted to see you, Clare. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I know we're going to be talking about, I've got a wee copy of it here for anybody that hasn't seen it, your really successful book, Embroidering Her Truth, Mary Queen of Scots and the Language of Colour. Clare, your book's been described as an alternative biography on Mary Queen of Scots. It's this alternative approach, I think, that we'll be focusing on tonight as part of the themes explored in Imagine Spaces. But before you do some readings, I know you've got some readings prepared for us, but before you do that, would you mind telling us briefly just a little bit about yourself and how you came to be where you are now, your background and how you...
Right. Well, what I prepared was a kind of 20-minute introduction to myself, how I got into writing, a little bit about my first book, and then about Embroidering Her Truth and how I approached both those books. So should I just go ahead with all that? Yeah, absolutely. Everybody happy with that? And then we'll move on to discussion and question and answers. So thank you everybody for coming. So first, hopefully a short and hopefully helpful review of me and my textile and writing career. I learned to sew as a child and would have chosen it as a profession was I not deemed to by the teachers to have an academic brain. And so I was steered towards studying English and medieval history at Glasgow University, where I have to admit I found papal legislation strangely fascinating. But mid-course, I switched to drama and on graduation started out what I optimistically called my video career, my theatre career. I became political, swerved into community arts, and began to make banners. Oh dear. There we go. In time, I established a community sewing enterprise in Glasgow called Needleworks. But in 2013, I changed direction again and went to the MA in writing practice at the University of Dundee. For my final dissertation, I had no thrilling crime novel in progress, nor a collection of perceptive short stories to submit. What I knew about was sewing. So that's what I wrote about. My professor, Kirsty Gunn, who's here, and other tutors encouraged me to expand it into a book, and Threads of Life was born. I was surprised at how dismayed, however, even some of my closest friends were when I told them I was writing a book about needlework. But suspicion that this might not be considered a subject worthy of publication was confirmed when I joined a creative writing group. And I'll read you a short extract from Threads of Life to give you a taste of how that proposed book on sewing was initially received. A guest writer has been invited to host the creative writing group I have recently joined. He asked us to introduce ourselves and say a little about what we're working on. As each member outlines their memoir, crime thriller, historical novel, or the collection of short stories, the writer nods encouragingly. Then it is my turn. I tell him I'm writing a book about the social, emotional, and political significance of sewing. The writer does not nod. Instead, he pauses, leans forward, and places his elbows on the table, then slowly interlaces his fingers. Ah, yes, he says. I can just see me going into my local bookstore to see if they have that bestseller on social, political, emotional sewing. His look to is pitying. We read extracts from work, the memoir, the thriller, the short story. Certain of further ridicule, I read what I have brought. The opening of a chapter where I describe my discovery of an old patchwork quilt. To my and the writer's surprise, he finds it moving and interesting. He said it reveals a world he knows little about. He says the writing is beautiful. My faith in the book is restored. It had passed an important test to undo a prejudice and to enlighten. The following week, the reader of the group asked me how my book on knitting is coming along. I leave the group. There are only so many battles I have the spirit to fight. Threads of Life, to my and everyone's amazement, reached the Sunday Times bestseller list, was Waterston's Book of the Month, was chosen as Radio 4's Book of the Week, and was co-recipient of a Salter Award for first book. It was published in America and translated into Italian and Dutch. It could be described as a history of sewing, but it is more an exploration of why sewing matters. Organizing chapters headed by simple single words such as loss, protection, community allowed me scope to merge fact, memoir and reflection, and offer a shift of tone and pace that might not have been possible in a strictly chronological history. It also freed me up to be more lyrical at times, to lift the prose from the factual to the more poetic. And the last sentence of the book is a good example of that. Sewing is a way to mark our existence in cloth, patterning our place in the world, voicing our identity, sharing something of ourselves with others, and leaving the indelible evidence of our presence in stitches held fast by our touch. Researching and writing the book presented its own challenges. Most of what I was exploring, why people sew, was scarcely documented. I had to delve deep into books on social history, on therapy, on political upheaval, on slavery, to find within them rare references to needlework, which were used as an acts of protection, protest, or self-preservation. It was hard to branch into a broad vocabulary. There are only 2 words to describe working with a needle: sewing and needlework, and at a push, stitchery. So I had to find another way to avoid repetition and monotony. I created word lists, chapter by chapter, to ensure that wrapped around these key terms was a wider, more emotive variety of verbs and adjectives that differed chapter by chapter and offered a variance of mood. In chapter 2, called Power, the central figure was Mary, Queen of Scots. And my research for that chapter uncovered a rich trove of underexposed primary material related to the Scottish Queen's material world. The treasurer's accounts, recording what she had spent during her reign on fabric, silk thread, clothes, and other textiles. The inventories of what textiles she had inherited, what she brought with her from France to Scotland, and what she left behind when she fled to England. I found a small cache of academic papers online where historians had examined specific aspects of her reign, the masked revelries at the Scottish court, the preparations for Prince James's baptisms, Mary's own embroidery. And I thought it might make an interesting book to revisit Mary, Queen of Scots' personal and political life through textiles she displayed, gifted, and created. Some people voiced skepticism at the proposal. With so many books out there about the Scottish Queen, was there any need of another? I shared their doubts, but had to trust my instincts that viewing her through the prism of her textiles might prove revelatory. Aware that such a book would have to pass muster in the world of academia, I embarked on an MA in historical research at the University of Stirling under the stern but supportive supervision of Dr. Alistair Mann. For my assignments, I had to learn a different way to write, writing that was succinct, tightly focused, and most importantly, evidence-based. I took a course in paleography to enable me to decipher the erratic and idiosyncratic handwriting of the 16th century. The most challenging aspect of writing what became Embroidering Her Truth, Mary, Queen of Scots and the Language of Power, was switching from that newly learned academic prose to my own voice again, to regain a looser, more conversational style of writing, where a blend of historical fact, memoir, and reflection proved effective. This was more challenging, however, as the book's trajectory had to be strictly chronological, as it was to be, in essence, a biography, but told through Mary's material world. It was hard to balance what the reader needed to know about the Scottish Queen's life and reign and what I wanted to tell about her use of textiles without making a forced or uneasy combination. In the end, as seems to be the case for me, the chapter headings prove key. I decided to title each chapter by naming a specific 16th century textile. This allowed me the license to expand on the social, emotional, and political background that surrounded it. So, for example, chapter 2 was titled The Fettineer Banner, after a 16th century Scottish ecclesiastical banner, and headed up the chapter on the Reformation. Chapter 5 was called A Suit of Savage Attire, after a costume used in Prince James's baptismal celebrations, and it enabled me to stray into the nature of revelries at Mary's court. Once I had the chapter headings, I could then organise what became a mountain of notes into different files, and instead of a morass of information, I now had a workable framework. What became overwhelming, however, was the amount of material I have to sift through, the hundreds of books written about Mary, the treasurer's accounts and state papers collected in volumes that usually ran to more than 700 pages each, Mary's own voluminous correspondence, mostly in French. In what was a controversial life, it was vital that I read widely, absorbing diverse opinions on her political and personal progress, in order to find, if not consensus, then at least an acceptable tipping point to opinion. I also had to be wary of other people's authors' claims. One had Mary in a dungeon for 19 years. And even John Guy, her seminal biographer, correlated Mary's subversive and self-revelatory embroidery with her love of pets. It became all too easy for my focus to wander. I spent more than a month fascinated by the treasurer's accounts, becoming immersed in the wardrobe accounts of Mary's father and grandfather, James IV and V, research that had to be ditched once I got Mary firmly back in my grip. Elements of the research were trickier than others. Inventories where textile terms written in Old French and Older Scots, terse annotations that noted dispersals from the royal wardrobe but provided scant details of their intended use, fantastic quotes in a variety of books, but with no note of their source. Then there was lockdown, which happened mid-research and mid-writing. With the deadline looming, suddenly I had no access to national libraries, the Scottish Records Office, or other places. I couldn't visit Mary's palaces or her places of captivity. Instead, I had to resort to online research, sourcing facsimile copies of treasurer's accounts sent from India, and buying vast numbers of books at huge expense, never knowing whether I would find a single line or 3 chapters which might prove pertinent. At the end, there was what I call the hell of footnotes to contend with. The discovery that while I might have noted the book's title beside a fascinating and useful fact, I had omitted to add the page number or vice versa. Nights of exasperating toil ensued. In the end, I had to come to an accommodation and accept that while the delicious nuggets of insight might still persist, they would evade me. But there were also exciting breakthroughs. Convinced that Mary's purchase of a vast amount of green silk for her cabinet room, the first she had made on arriving back in Scotland, pointed to her installing a cabinet of curiosity at the Palace of Holyrood House, a detail not mentioned in any of the numerous books I had read. I scoured state papers and came across a report by the English ambassador, Thomas Randolph, where he commented that Mary often retreated to her secret cabinet, where she kept those things she esteems either for antiquity, novelty, or that she takes pleasure in. And I could at last demonstrate that the 18-year-old Queen arrived to an alien Scotland had, as her priority, created a private space for herself where she harboured the residue of her life in France as a repository of self. What was critical to me was to find a way to make the textiles as central as Mary, and I had to find a way to recapture their sensory impact in the courts of the late Renaissance. The book had to be not just a history, but an evocation of an age. To do that, I had to rekindle their presence, and I'll read you a passage to better explain my approach. In the heightened theatrics of Renaissance court life, light was a quintessential quality. It became, like thread and cloth, a medium of display. The lustre of the fabrics themselves, the figured velvets, shot silks, and sheen damask was heightened by the gold and silver of their embroidery. The glimmer of these amongst denser hues was sometimes deliberately intensified, the cloth scratched or raised to release a frayed quiver of luminosity. Spangles called trambulants were sewn on purposefully loose to ensure they caught the light during movement. Silk embroidered cloths were laid beneath silver plate or Venetian glass on banquet tables to create spilled refraction of colour. It was light that animated cloth. Slivers of light bounced from textile surface to create a moving energy that contrasted with the solid surroundings of wood and stone. And textiles were deliberately positioned to change the effect of their sheen and their glint of their embellishments in different kinds of light: daylight, moonlight, candlelight, and the reflected light of mirror, to enable a change of atmosphere and mood. But it is through my passage of memoir that I attempted, if not to retell, at least connect to history creatively. They act as a bridge between then and now, between me and Mary, as well as providing a respite from the terrible tragic tale of Mary's life. And I'll end with a short extract. There is only one outfit that I've ever worn that had the impact of Renaissance glory. It was bought as a panacea for a lost love. In the months of my first true romance, I spent the prerequisite hours locking eyes with my beloved over cooling cups of coffee, writing the necessary reams of bad poetry, and suffering, as is usual for first loves, the pain of its end. Shortly after our breakup, I was invited to an event that I knew he would be attending. Pride dictated that there had to be triumph, a love overcome, an ex-love regretful of his decision, and, if possible, a garnering of attention from potential new loves eager to fill his shoes. It called for spectacular glamour, the gloss of a new me. As luck would have it, I had just received an instalment of my student grant, and I took it, all of it, to Fraser's in Glasgow, then the most exclusive department store in the city. I scoured its rails, searching out the perfect redress to abandonment. What I found was a body-hugging midi dress made in the softest of velvets. It was patterned and swirled with the deepest pinks and ruby reds against a background of deep forest green. Its pièce de résistance, however, was a row of tiny velvet-covered buttons that fastened at the front. They were caught in braided loops arranged to leave just a slither of flesh visible from neck to navel. To complete the outfit, I added teetering high heels and red crocodile leather and sheer burgundy stockings. I went to the event and made my entrance. The dress achieved all I could have hoped for it. It gathered around me a cluster of admirers, leaving my first love, my lost love, standing marooned on the edge, witness to my sartorial triumph. Thank you. The book.
But I think the thing that I find really interesting, and you did actually talk about it in your introduction there as well, is your bringing of the self into it, and a kind of, you know, linking your own memories as you did in the last reading, you know, linking this and using these memories as you do often to link into the next chapter, the themes that you're going to talk about in Mary's life.
I think part of that, Loretta, is hopefully helping the reader to feel that what was happening then, or the feelings or emotions, is still relevant in their lives. Yeah. So you're trying to bring this point of relevance into the book, so that you're not just connected to yourself, but the reader feels connected in a different way. Obviously, there's no connection between me and Mary, Queen of Scots, but actually we did share an understanding of textiles. Yeah. And so that's what I tried to get across, and we did share in different ways of using textiles. Now, Mary had fashion dolls, like I had dolls that, you know, were dressed through her tailor in the court, but, you know, etc. Or she had a love as a Catholic of the ceremony of Mass and the liturgical vestments that went along with that. And again, I could relate to that. So it's all about that, finding points of relation. Yeah. You know. Okay.
Absolutely, and I think that earlier on, Kirsty and Gail and I were talking about the book and tonight, and we all kind of had cultural connections. You know, have we lost? Oh, you're there.
Yes,
Sorry,
I'll come back in. I don't know what
screen.
happened.
Yeah, I think although we don't have those personal connections with Mary Queen of Scots, there are all sorts of cultural connections, and I think your use of textiles in particular brings that out. I think because, as you say, you do relate it to the present day, which I suppose is in some ways about trying to fill in those gaps between the historical evidence and, as you say, making readers connect.
And making that thing when, when I was visiting Lochleven, then actually being able to say, this is what the boat trip was like, this is what the weather was like, this is what it physically felt like to be at that place. And anybody who goes to Lochleven would feel the same sensations.
Absolutely. I just wonder about your decision to write it in that way. I know that you've given us the background. I think your extract about the reaction to Threads of Life was typical, I think, because it is difficult maybe for people to get a grasp of where that would sit. It kind of crosses genres in some ways. But I wonder if you had any particular influences in other writers of history or biography that
well, my great
way.
kind of inspiration for Threads of Life was Edward de Val's The Hare with Amber Eyes, which is a book where he retraces his own family history through these little Japanese ivory statue, tiny little carvings, which he had been left by his great uncle, and he uses those. He's a ceramicist in real life,
right.
and so he, as an artist maker, was able to convey the physical sensation of these little Nizuki and how they felt to him as a ceramicist. And it inspired me to think that I could maybe use sewing in the same way as somebody who does, sew, does embroider, and has spent a lifetime involved with textiles, that I could use that as a conduit to exploring things in a wider social political stage. And although Edward de Val was doing it in an autobiographical way, then I felt that actually there's a way that, as I say, I could do it, but where the context would be social and political history.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. But the idea of merging your knowledge, your practice knowledge as a maker with the world out there, and how the things that are made are experienced by other people, was the key link for me.
Yeah, but absolutely. And I suppose, I mean, the challenge which you did talk about there is how you take that experience and your knowledge of that and weave that into a historical biography.
Yes, it's very interesting, because obviously in Edward de Val's book, for those that have read it, he's going through a personal journey. So he really does go and then traces the steps of his family, goes to places where they've lived, etc. And when I was writing Threads of Life, although that isn't about a journey, then I found that my background reading became increasingly books about landscape.
Right.
Macfarlane, Nan Shepherd, books that were about people who were out in the land exploring. And it seemed to me to be although I didn't understand at the start, then the more that I was needing to read those kinds of books, it came to me that what I was trying to do was explore the landscape of textiles. And then take people on a journey through a landscape that they might be familiar in one way, and yet had lots of other hidden things that they hadn't noticed, which was exactly what I was trying to do with textiles.
That's so interesting, because I think that when we were talking about this afternoon, we were thinking in terms of how the kind of writing that you have that links your own personal experiences into other themes is quite often done through landscape or through nature writing, but that's what I find is quite interesting, and I think that's that form of essay writing is what you want to try to bring into historical writing, but I personally think that's quite a difficult thing to do. So
that's right. I mean, the other thing I did which actually worked, which sounded very strange, was when I had written threads, it had gone out to some publishers, they'd been interested but not interested enough to take it on, and I knew that it needed another kind of energy in it, but I didn't quite know what that was or how to do it. And so actually I signed up to do a crime writing course with Louise Welsh at the Arvin Foundation. And I chose Louise Welsh because she is so great on plot and character. And somehow, as a writer, she seems to get very quickly to the energy behind a story. So I phoned Arvin and said, look, I'm actually writing a book about sewing, non-fiction, nothing to do with crime writing, but I'd really like to come on this course. It was a lateral jump.
Right.
And I went to that course, and that unlocked for me a different pace and a different kind of, just a different pace and a different kind of, well, the only word to use is energy that I could put behind that book that brought it into a different kind of life.
And you've obviously transferred that energy into your writing, as we said earlier on.
Yes. So
I'm aware. Sorry, can I?
No. So although I wasn't actually dealing with character in that sense, what I was trying to do was bring the nature of people I was talking about alive on the page. Yeah,
absolutely. I am aware I could talk to Clare all night here. But I'm aware that other people may well want to come in at some point.
Yes, please feel free. That's what I'm here for.
Have questions for you too, Clare, but fascinating. So anybody got any questions or comments on reading? Or?
Could I just, Clare, can I ask you, I'm going to jump in because there's always this slightly awkward silence when no one says anything and I'm the blabbermouth here. So I'm just going to spill out kind of, I was taken by what you've said, and I haven't finished the book. I've got kind of a third of the way into the book, and I was quite interested in that what you've referred to really as a clash, a tension, a creative tension between that kind of professionalized discourse of history, where you're telling the story of this particular individual, and you're also telling a social history of the time, not only about this individual, because you go, of course, you cast your nets wider than Mary Queen of Scots, and then the personal moments which allow you to connect on a certain level. I wondered to what extent, I mean, you talk about the trickiness of that. I wondered to what extent you needed also to have something that allowed I'm feeling my way into this. I don't quite know where I'm going, but I'm asking, I suppose, about historical subjectivity and researcher subjectivity, and also a kind of novelistic subjectivity as well, that it's all kind of combined in the way you write this. So two questions come out of that. You know, why not a novel, for one? Why not historical fiction, which allows you to capture some of the things that you're doing? Secondly, is it a problem or is it a boon and a gift to kind of to think of your subjectivity as a researcher, as a textile maker, kind of allowing yourself as that becomes a window almost into that particular world? Was that a kind of productive window for you to think about?
Yes, I think it's different things. I mean, obviously what I'm trying to do through the kind of writing I'm doing is that I'm both showing and telling.
Yes, yes.
So I have a little note on my notice board that says show, don't tell. So it's been there since, you know, when I was first writing Threads of Life. So it's about how you actually put in front of people. Threads of Life had no illustrations, and what I wanted to do was to use my writing to give the visual images to people who were reading that book. At the same time, I want people to feel. So I wanted to actually trigger an emotional response to what I was writing. So you've got those three things. You've got the telling of the story, you've got the feeling for what's happening to those people who, emotionally, that you feel emotional about what's happening to those people. So you've got engagement in that sense, emotional engagement you're trying to encourage. And you've also got the being able to see what it is I'm talking about. And it became for me easier to combine those three things through that mix of historical research and factual telling, a bit of reflection, and also memoir.
I mean,
it was more difficult in the Mary Queen of Scots book because there was so much that happened in her life that I could at times got carried away with the biography. And I had to at times cull the biography. And say, so for instance, apart from Maury, her half brother, and I think Ruthven's mentioned once, there's no other Scottish nobles named in the book, because each of those people had another backstory that had I had to go into that would have made it much more convoluted as a book, and the focus on the textiles would have been diluted. So I had to be very strict with myself about what were the absolutely necessary parts of Mary's story that had to be told in order to be people to understand the context in which her textiles were displayed or created or gifted. Which meant that I had to decide what not to put in. Which at times was difficult because there were bits that you wanted to put in that people would expect to be there, but you just had to do it. It also became, as Mary's biography can do, it became increasingly lengthy. And I'm not a great one for lengthy books, both as a reader and a writer. And so, it was that thing of deciding, yes, this weekend you will cut out 7,000 words. You will lose them. They have to go. So I had to be vicious in terms of my editing.
Just one small kind of a question related to that is, to what extent do you feel that this book intervenes in history? I mean, the reason why I ask that is because of course I'm supervising Loretta's thesis on Isabella Bird, and thinking that history misses a trick by not actually engaging with subjectivity and lived experience, which your book does, of course, and actually does that very beautifully. I wanted to know, to what extent does this shift the parameters of history or historical writing for you?
Well, I think it's just a different way of getting people interested in history. I mean, I think there are, I would absolutely relish a very academic piece of writing in history terms, because some books you want to read because you want to have that forensic historical detail. Other books you want to read because you want to get a different viewpoint on a well-worn subject. And other books you want to read because you want to rummage around a bit. And this is a kind of rummaging around in a sense. It's rummaging around the actual society that Mary was part of in the Scottish court, the male-dominated culture that she arrived back to, which again is rarely touched on, but is very interesting. It looks at what was happening in terms of women's agency in the 16th century, which again might be there in other books written about women's culture, but aren't necessarily as present in historical books. So I was able to, in a sense, arm myself with material like I did with Threads of Life that came from other kinds of genres, but fitted well into the style of writing that I adopted, if that makes sense. But it's not. I
won't say more. I'm just thinking that Barbara's got her hands up and someone else wants to jump in, so I'm just going to stop myself here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Alison. If you unmute yourself, Alison.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And I appreciate all the research you've done and whittling that down, I know from experience, is so difficult. I just wondered if you were under any pressure to sort of put your writing into a genre. It seems that you've created a bit of a new genre. It's not a novel, as Gail said. Were you under any pressure, or did you take advice? Or
no, I think there was an emerging genre which I kind of piggybacked on, which was like H is for a Hawk. You know, there was Mauve, the book that was about the discovery of the dye mauve. Number of books that dealt with a single idea, but around them had a personal story as well as a history. And I think I had begun to discover that, and not in a conscious way, but it became the natural way for me to write threads. And once I'd written threads of life, then for the book about Mary, because I wanted to try and create this connection, then I thought, well, why don't I put in some memoir as well? Why don't I, reflect a little bit on her position as a woman in the Scottish court and what that must have felt like? What did the Palace of Holyrood House feel like for her at 18, coming from the incredibly splendid chateaus of France to what was a very claustrophobic palace in Scotland? And very soon after she arrived, she came into some of the coldest winters the country had ever seen during what was known as the Little Ice Age. So climate was a really important aspect as well of her experience of being Queen in Scotland. And so I think that was already out there in terms of other books in another range of ways.
Yeah, and of course, anything to do with textiles and females, you'll probably have more of a fight to get a publisher. And did you have to have trouble finding a publisher?
Yeah. Well, originally, in actual fact, when it went out originally, people really didn't. There wasn't so much difficulty for people looking at that stage. Was the balance between what they said was head and heart. And some felt I had too much head, and they wanted to have more of my personal story. But I wasn't keen to do my life in textiles. That's not what I was writing about. I was quite happy to do little pieces about what I had done in textiles that were relevant again to what I was trying to talk about in that particular chapter. But I didn't want it to be autobiographical in any shape or form. And at the end of the day, I was really lucky and had 3 publishers interested in acquiring the book. Now, that's not to say when I started to then work with the publisher sector, then there wasn't a lot of rewriting to do, because sometimes they'd say, well, with that chapter, I don't feel as engaged with the people you're talking about as I should do. So could you give me more context so that I understand that particular war more, or I understand that particular situation they were in more? And that was good for me. I really enjoyed that. I'd had more of it in the earlier drafts, which is why some publishers had said it was too much head and not enough heart. So I was very happy to put more of that back in again.
Yeah, I think we have a question from Kirsty.
Claire, it's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation series. I guess you've cast light on so many really, really interesting things in terms of your approach, the way you made this wonderful book. I'm absolutely fascinated by how you've shared with us this idea of using other kinds of texts to provide energy for your own, that for Threads of Life, you picked up that kind of Robert Macfarlane, Nan Shepherd, nature walking, and that you then followed Louise Welsh and this idea of the crime novel, or the notion of the dramatic personality for this beautiful book. This, to me, absolutely speaks to everything about Imagined Spaces and our sense of risk and adventure that takes place when we pick up a pen and start to write. Can you begin to imagine how your next book might be in terms of imagining other kinds of texts to give you instruction and inspiration on following your own narrative story?
Well, my next book is going to be trickier, actually. I've decided to work on a book which isn't about textiles. It's going to be called Wonder, Transient Moments of Small Delights. So it's going to be about all sorts of things that, again, are rarely written about in that context of being delightful. So toy theatres, puppets, blowing bubbles, sand sculptures, street art, the range of things we come across usually by chance, things that are usually free. A lot of them sometimes are things that people make at home for domestic entertainment, and they are things that are temporary. They're experienced and then they're gone. And I just think there's a whole, again, history of those things, an interesting thing to say, interesting things to be said about what it is that those small moments of joy bring us, creative moments of joy bring us, and to investigate what is around now. Is there a revival of that kind of thing happening, which I believe there is, and in what ways is that manifesting itself? So it's going to be tricky because it's going to be a bit more like Threads in terms of very much more eclectic. It's going to be tricky to find the themes that I pin things to, because I don't want it just to be a chapter on puppets and then a chapter on toy theatres. I want it to be a bit more philosophical than that. And so I haven't yet. I'm just going to start that next week. It's just finally been. I've had the first meeting with my editor. That's the go-ahead meeting. So I'm just about to start musing on that, background reading, thinking, yeah, and then we'll see what emerges. But at the moment,
love that, Claire. I love that you're talking about waiting to see what will emerge, and everything that you're describing sounds like a kind of series of poems and a series of enormous risks, and the very notion of the delicacy of the bubble, and can the shape hold?
Yes, exactly.
Such a treat.
So we're given an opportunity to, in a sense, become more poetic rather than less poetic, which should be interesting. It's still a memoir. There will still be funny stories.
But we have got a hand up from Ellie. Sorry, I'm not taking over, Loretta. I'm just
No, it's okay.
looking at the hands up.
I had a quick scan earlier, but yeah, I see it now. Ellie.
Went up. Hi, hi, Claire.
Hi,
my question is around the research that you spoke about a little bit, but as somebody who's been a bit buried in research for an idea for the past year, firstly, I guess there's a couple of questions. Firstly, do you think you could have written this book without doing the history research MA? Is it too hard to do history research without a history MA? And then secondly,
I don't think.
broadly, go on.
Sorry, Ellie. Carry on.
The second one was just, I'm fascinated to understand a bit more about your process of research, like sort of how much, if you could put a ratio on how much time you spent researching versus writing, and if you've got any tips generally for that sort of like really fun but sometimes extremely frustrating process of finding lots of interesting stuff and wondering how to weave it into a narrative.
Well, the first one is really, I could have written the book without doing the MA, but I don't think I would have written such a good book that would have, say, pass muster with historians. And I did want to do a book that historians found acceptable, at least, because otherwise it would have been a lesser book, really. It had to be able to stand up to the rigor of proper academic assessment, I felt. So all the sources had to be in place, all the evidence had to be able to be proven, etc., etc. And yes, that was frustrating at times, because I might, read something or hear about something that sounded just fantastic, but I couldn't find the evidence. If I couldn't find the evidence, I didn't put it in. Whereas in Threads of Life, I might have been a bit more, you know, it is said that, it is possible that, you know, etc. But with Mary Queen of Scots, I was much less, I did much less kind of conjectural thinking. And I think that made it a stronger book, which is what I mean by a good book. I mean, a stronger book because of that. Research, I would say probably, if you put it into thirds, 2/3 of the work was research and 1/3 was writing. A third of the writing was the moving around of the research.
Mhm.
You know, which bit of research goes where. You know, that kind of arrangement takes a long time to get right. About, you know, and that's why I said there that eventually deciding on naming the chapters after particular textiles. You know, I didn't want to do Mary and the Reformation and whatever. I wanted to do what was happening in Scottish material culture at the Reformation. And so being able to have an ecclesiastical banner as the heading for that chapter allowed me the license to explore that theme. And that's why I was saying with this next book, I'm going to toil. I know I'm going to toil finding the right way to organize the chapters so that I get the scope to be philosophical without people getting wearied by that approach and wanting more history or more funny stories. So a lot of research, and the research doesn't stop, even though you're writing, obviously, you're still researching while you're writing, because then you start to write something, oh, gosh, I wonder what, like eventually when I was writing about the mask entertainments, then I thought really it would be really interesting to talk about the what mask costumes looked like. Now, I hadn't researched that because it wasn't part of what I thought I would be writing about. I thought I'd be writing about court entertainments, but not specifically masks, which are a particular form. And so I then went off for another week or two and got as many books. There aren't that many. Most of them are about the literature of masks, not about the actual design of masks and sets and costumes. So again, back to Abe Books to find secondhand books on mask costumes that had been written in the 1970s, or whatever, and explored what I could of that to be able to write about those costumes. So you're researching right up to the end because you'd think, oh, it'd be just nice to put a little bit more about, or your editor says, yes, that's very good, saying like the light reflected in mirrors. Could you give me examples? Well, no, there's no examples in Mary's Court. There's not even mirrors mentioned in Mary's Court. So I had to then go back to look at Henry VIII's court and found some examples from that court to put in the book. I hope that isn't too daunting.
No, that's really useful. I think the points about the structure that you pin it on definitely chimes with where I'm sort of just starting to grasp at, and
Right.
that process is.
And your framework can change, you know, once you've got your idea of your framework. I mean, my chapter headings for Threads of Life changed all the time. You know, from, you know, I've got community value loss, you know, I did have others in there. I changed those single words over and over again before I finally came up with what were the chapter heads. But at least each of those chapter heads, even as they changed, worked for how that chapter was emerging. But I knew I was going to just have that one single word. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
I think that was a really interesting question, Ellie, and I'm glad you you asked it. Mine was kind of around advice to people who are trying to write in this way or do their historical research. And I think the balance is quite important. I think, Gail, there was something came up in the chat about the time spent in editing and research. I just saw it flash up. But I think, Claire, that comes back in a sense to the discipline that you were talking about, you know, when you had to be quite disciplined about what to include and what not to include.
yes, and when you've got, you know, I mean, I had box files after because it was 4 years in the writing, the Mary Queen of Scots book, including the MA. So I had box
Right.
files and box files of notes, all handwritten. I write very, very small when I'm taking notes. And so I would think there is a, you know, for instance, I never found the wonderful quote in a letter from Mary to Elizabeth about that Elizabeth would not steal her soul. I looked everywhere for that quote
Right.
again. I found it after the book was published, but I had lost it. I had it somewhere. I looked at, I had all my 100 books of Mary here, and I still couldn't find that quote. And so eventually I couldn't include it because I couldn't find it.
And I wonder, I wonder if that's the difference then between some historical fiction and the kind of history writing that you're doing. You know, you just, if it's not there, you won't put it in.
Exactly. Whereas if
Find
it's
the
historical
evidence.
fiction, I mean, somebody had asked me earlier, it was Gail, had I thought about writing fiction? Actually, for one of my first assignments, if you remember, Kirsty, I did write the 3 chapters of a novel called Embroidery, which was a dual period. So it was actually medieval through to Mary Queen of Scots time and then modern, and it was about an embroidery that had been handed through centuries, which then became which then was part of a murder case, and which a young journalist then unravelled the story of, and it turned out to be the embroidery. It was not the important thing. The embroidery was actually papered, backed by a piece of paper, which turned out to be the baptismal certificate for what was thought to be Mary, Queen of Scots' real child, who was supplanted by a blow-in who was James VI. Anyway, it's a long story. So I wrote 3 chapters of that, and I would like in an odd way to return to that, but because I've now written so much about threads and about Mary, it would seem a bit strange to now do a book that is about all those things again, but in a novel way. So I think I'm going to ditch it. I did spend some work in the summer on it again and enjoyed it, but I think it's too close to what I've already written to ring true somehow now. So I have to think of another way around that. But yes, I'd be interested in doing just a novel, creative writing at some stage.
All right. Okay. Interesting. Any other comments? Oh, yeah. Jeannie, sorry. Trying to read the small writing there.
Like Gail, I'm about 2/3 of the way through the book, or just over halfway actually, and I'm so enjoying it. And I've really enjoyed listening to you this evening as well. And I don't really have a question just so much as an observation, because you went on this course about crime writing, and listening to you coming up with words like evidence, and looking for this here and seeking this, and just like detective work.
Yes.
This idea of research, and then seeking the truth of what you're saying. That you couldn't find that point. You didn't have your evidence. You couldn't take it to the page. To the reader. You couldn't take it to the reader till you're absolutely certain. That is so useful, and wonderful. And I can see where you've just followed these things like a detective until you're quite sure of your ground. So thank you. It's fascinating.
Thank you, Judy. And as you say, for me, it is like detective work. Yeah. And that's the most enjoyable bit of the research, when you get a lead that you think, if I look into that further, that might take me somewhere that's really interesting. And like I said about that bit about the Cabinet of Curiosity, in none of the books about Mary, and I have now read many, many, many books about Mary, none of them mention her Cabinet of Curiosity. Palace of Holyrood House has never mentioned a Cabinet of Curiosity, despite her having a cabinet room in her little small chambers at the palace. And I just felt in my bones that she did have a Cabinet of Curiosities. So I did have to pour through the 800-page volumes of the state papers in order to find that one sentence from Thomas Randolph, but it was worth it. You can imagine my eureka moment.
Yes. I think it's the excitement of that.
Excitement, and because when she left for England, then eventually they did an inventory of her possessions, and there's a very poignant list of things that she left behind. Things like one white mitten, a cameo of Francois II, little beads in a box, some feathers from a headdress. And these are the kinds of things that would be in a cabinet of curiosity. So I had already known about that inventory and its contents, and I felt absolutely convinced that some of those objects were part of her cabinet of curiosity that she had brought with her from France. And so I was so delighted, and you can imagine Mary, it just showed another side of her, of being able to share with her most intimate acquaintances these small bits of mementos and exotic articles, etc., that were what she had, the tangible things she had collected in her young life up to that date, that kind of spoke of her interests, her education, and her family, you know. So
also, could I just ask you a very brief question about your relationship with Mary now? You know, because clearly your knowledge is encyclopedic now, and you must have got so very close to her through the writing of this, closer than you've ever been. How did it feel to have come to the end of the book in terms of relationship?
Yes, when I think it's because with that kind of book, the ending is totally tedious, because you are just doing all those endnotes. There's over nearly 500 endnotes. There's the bibliography. When the book is written and then you spend the time doing all those final things, the checking of all the copyright for any visual images they're using in the book, etc., you are so wanting to see the back of it and of Mary, because you're tired, your brain is tired, and you're looking at material you've been looking at for 4 years, trying to sift through these notes again to see if you can find which page number that quotation came from. And so when it was done, it was done. I absolutely had no kind of sense of longing to stay with it, or and I haven't since, you know. And I'm sure when something else comes to light about a material world that I didn't know about, then I'll be, you know, annoyed. But apart from that, I feel I did it the best that I could, and anything else was in somebody else's hands, and I was comfortable with that. I came to an accommodation, as I say, which I think we all have to do at a certain point with the writing. We have to say, actually, this is what I can do with this material. Somebody else can do something more or something different, but this is what I can do. You know?
Claire, I just think that's a wonderful end note. I think we're beginning to run out of time here, but I just think that's just such a good note to end on, you know, that even though we're tired or we've worked so hard on something, that you just come to the point where that's it. Yeah.
That's it.